The ice auger screamed to life at 6:30 in the morning, and I could already feel the familiar weight of someone watching me from across the frozen lake. My breath plumed in the cold Minnesota air as I positioned the blade over a promising spot, ready to drill through 2 feet of solid ice on Lake Serenity, the private body of water I'd bought into 3 years ago when I purchased my cabin. My name is Stephen Palmer, and I'd been ice fishing since I was 8 years old, following my grandfather out onto frozen lakes just like this one. The motor kicked into high gear, and the auger bit into the ice with that satisfying crunch that every fisherman knows. I was about 300 yards from shore, right in the middle of what the local maps called the Eastern Basin, known for decent northern pike this time of year. My watch showed 6:45 when I finished the third hole. The sun was just starting to paint the horizon orange and purple, and I figured I had a solid day of fishing ahead of me. I was setting up my tip-ups when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone shouting across the ice. I looked up and saw a figure standing on the shore near the Meadowbrook Estates development, waving their arms like they were trying to flag down a rescue helicopter. I ignored them at first, focusing on rigging my lines with minnows I'd picked up the night before from Hanson's bait shop in Pine Ridge. The shouting got louder. I could make out that it was a woman's voice, shrill and insistent, carrying across the frozen expanse like a siren. I stood up from my bucket and squinted toward the shore. She was marching onto the ice now, wearing what looked like a puffy white coat and boots that definitely weren't meant for ice walking. Her steps were careful but determined. I figured I should probably see what her problem was before she fell through a pressure crack or something. As she got closer, I could make out her features. Middle-aged, blonde hair pulled back tight, and a face that was already red, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or anger. "Excuse me," she called out when she was about 50 yards away. "Excuse me, sir." I raised a hand in greeting. "Morning. Do you have any idea what time it is?" She was breathing hard from the walk across the ice, her words coming out in sharp bursts. "About 6:50, I said, glancing at my watch again. "Everything okay?" "No, everything is not okay." She stopped about 10 feet from me, apparently not trusting herself to come any closer on the ice. "You woke up half the neighborhood with that noise." We have noise ordinances in Meadowbrook Estates, and they begin at 7 in the morning on weekends. I looked at her, then at my auger lying on the ice, then back at her. "I'm not in Meadowbrook Estates. You're close enough that we can hear you. The sound carries across the water." "It's not water right now, it's ice, and I'm on private property, my private property technically." I gestured at the expanse around us. "I own a share in this lake, bought it with my cabin." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't care what you think you own. The homeowners association has rules about noise, and you're violating them. I'm going to have to ask you to pack up and leave, or wait until 7 to continue your activities." I felt my jaw tighten. I'd dealt with enough unreasonable people in my life to know where this was heading, but I tried to keep my voice level. "Madam, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not part of your HOA. I don't live in Meadowbrook Estates. My cabin is on the North Shore, completely separate property. The lake borders our development. Parts of it do, sure, but this isn't your lake. This is Lake Serenity, a private lake with multiple property owners around it. Your development doesn't own it." She pulled out her phone, which seemed like an odd move given we were standing on a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere. "I'm documenting this interaction. What's your name?" "Stephen Palmer." "And yours?" "Patricia Morrison. I'm the president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association." She said it like she was announcing she was the Queen of England. "We have 43 homes in our development, and all of them pay dues to maintain a peaceful, quiet community. Your noise is disrupting that. Patricia, I understand you want a quiet morning, but I'm allowed to be here. I'm allowed to drill holes. I'm fishing, which is legal on this lake for property owners, which I am. Not at 6:30 in the morning, you're not. I took a deep breath, watching it fog in the air between us. Your HOA rules don't apply to me. They apply to people who live in Meadowbrook Estates. I don't live there. I don't pay dues there. I'm not bound by your rules. We'll see about that. She was typing something on her phone now, her fingers moving fast despite the cold. I'm calling the police. The police. I couldn't help but laugh a little. For what? Ice fishing. For disturbing the peace. For violating noise ordinances. For trespassing, possibly. I'm not trespassing on my own property. She held up a finger to silence me, then pressed the phone to her ear. I stood there, minnow bucket in one hand, genuinely baffled at how a normal Saturday morning of ice fishing had turned into whatever this was. Yes, hello. I need to report a disturbance, Patricia said into her phone, her eyes locked on me like I was some kind of criminal. There's a man on Lake Serenity making excessive noise and refusing to follow community guidelines. Yes, I'll hold. I decided to go back to setting up my lines. If she wanted to stand there freezing while she waited for the cops to tell her the same thing I just did, that was her problem. I baited another hook, tied it off, and set the tip-up flag. The morning was getting brighter and I was wasting prime fishing time. Yes, officer, I'm still here, Patricia said. The lake behind Meadowbrook Estates. Yes, that's the one. He's about 300 yards from shore. Right in the middle. Yes, I'll stay here. She hung up and crossed her arms. They're sending someone. Great, I said. Maybe they can explain property rights to you better than I can. Maybe they can explain the law to you. We stood in awkward silence for a few minutes. I continued working on my setup, and she continued standing there like a security guard. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the white surface of the frozen lake. In any other circumstance, it would have been peaceful. How long have you lived in Meadowbrook? I asked, trying to make conversation since we were apparently stuck together. 3 years. We were one of the first families to buy in. And how long have people been ice fishing on this lake? I don't know. That's not the point. It kind of is, though. I mean, this lake has been here forever. People have been fishing it for decades. My grandfather used to fish here in the 70s, back before any of these developments existed. Times change. Communities have standards now. Communities that actually have jurisdiction do, sure. I set up another tip-up. Look, Patricia, I'm not trying to be difficult, I'm just trying to fish. I didn't realize the auger would carry that far, but even if I had known, I'm still within my rights to be here. We'll let the police decide that. Another 10 minutes passed. My hands were getting cold, so I pulled on an extra pair of gloves. Patricia was starting to shiver, shifting from foot to foot. I almost felt bad for her, standing out here in the cold just to make a point. You can head back if you want, I offered. I'm not going anywhere. The officer confined me. I'm staying right here. I need to make sure you don't leave before they arrive. I shrugged. Suit yourself. It took another 15 minutes before I saw the vehicle, a sheriff's deputy truck, black and white, pulling up to the access road near the boat launch. Patricia immediately started waving, as if the deputy could miss us standing in the middle of a white frozen lake. The deputy got out, and I could see him assessing the situation. He grabbed something from his truck, probably a jacket, and started walking out onto the ice. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this before, which made sense. This was Clearwater County, Minnesota. Every deputy here knew how to handle ice. As he got closer, I could see he was younger, maybe early 30s, with a thick beard and a practical winter uniform. His nameplate read Deputy Morrison. Wait, Morrison, Patricia, the deputy called out as he approached. "What's going on?" My heart sank a little. Of course they were related. "Kyle, thank God you're here," Patricia said, her voice suddenly warmer. "This man has been making excessive noise all morning, and he refuses to follow our community guidelines." Deputy Kyle Morrison looked at me, then at my fishing setup, then back at his relative. Because at this point, I was assuming she was either his mother, aunt, or some other close relation. "Madam, are you the one who called in the disturbance?" he asked, and I realized he was asking her, not me. "Yes, I'm Patricia Morrison, HOA president of Meadowbrook Estates. I called because this man was operating loud machinery before 7 a.m., violating our noise ordinances." Kyle looked at me. "Sir, can I get your name?" "Stephen Palmer. I own a cabin on the North Shore." I pointed in that direction. "Been here about 3 years. And you were using an auger this morning?" "Yes, sir. Started drilling holes around 6:30, 6:40. Standard ice fishing setup." Kyle nodded slowly, looking around at the lake, the shoreline, the developments visible in the distance. "Mr. Palmer, can I see some ID and proof of property ownership?" "Sure thing." I reached into my jacket and pulled out my wallet, handing him my driver's license. "I don't carry the deed with me, but I can give you the address and you can verify it." "What's the address?" 4782 Lakeview Trail, Pine Ridge. The property includes lake access and a stake in Lake Serenity through the Lake Serenity Property Owners Association. Kyle wrote this down in a small notebook. "And Meadowbrook Estates, that's 100 through 142 Meadow Lane," Patricia interjected. "Our HOA owns a portion of the lakeshore and has rules about noise and activities that affect our residents." "Does your HOA own the lake?" Kyle asked her. "We own the shoreline that borders it, but not the lake itself." Patricia hesitated. "The lake is adjacent to our property." Kyle looked at me. "And you say you own a share in the lake through the Property Owners Association?" "Yes, it's a private lake. There are about 20 properties around it, each with a stake in the lake itself. We have usage rights, fishing rights, and shared maintenance responsibilities." "Do you have any documentation of that with you?" "I've got the SL newsletter in my truck," I said. "That's the Serenity Lake Property Owners Association. Has all the membership info. I can walk back and get it if you need." "That would be helpful." The three of us started walking back toward shore, Patricia now silent but triumphant, looking like she'd already won. I wasn't so sure about that. Kyle seemed like he was actually thinking this through rather than just taking her side. We reached the shore, and I led the way to my pickup, parked at the small cleared area near my cabin's path. I pulled out the folder from my glove compartment, the one with all the Lake Association documents, and handed it to Kyle. He flipped through it carefully, reading the bylaws, the member list, the map showing the property divisions. He pulled out his phone and took a picture of a few pages. "Okay," he said finally. "So according to this, you're a member in good standing with the Serenity Lake Property Owners Association. You have fishing rights, boating rights, and the right to use the lake year-round for recreational purposes." "That's correct." He looked at Patricia. "And Meadowbrook Estates borders the lake but isn't part of this association. We're a separate development, newer, but we have rights too." "What rights specifically?" "The right to peace and quiet, the right to enjoy our properties without disruption." Kyle nodded slowly. He looked like he was choosing his words carefully. "Patricia, I understand your concern about the noise, but Mr. Palmer is on the lake, which based on this documentation he has legal access to. He's not in Meadowbrook Estates. Your HOA rules don't apply to him. But the noise affects us. Noise is going to happen near a lake. Boats in the summer, augers in the winter. That's part of living near water. If the noise was happening at midnight or 3 in the morning, we might have a public disturbance case, but 6:30 on a Saturday morning isn't unreasonable for lake activities. Our rules say 7 a.m. Your rules apply to your residents on your property. Mr. Palmer isn't your resident and he wasn't on your property. He was in the middle of the lake. Kyle handed me back my documents. Mr. Palmer, you're free to continue fishing. Just try to be mindful of the time in the future, maybe. I appreciate it, officer. I usually try to get out here earlier to set up before sunrise, actually. Today I slept in a bit. Patricia's face was getting red again, and not from the cold. This is ridiculous. So he can just make all the noise he wants and we have no recourse. If the noise becomes truly excessive or happens at unreasonable hours, you can file a formal complaint with the county. But ice fishing is a normal lake activity, and 6:30 a.m. isn't an unreasonable time. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can cite him for. So you're not going to do anything? There's nothing to do. No law has been broken. Kyle looked at me. Mr. Palmer, out of curiosity, how loud is the auger? I mean, I've used them before, but I'm wondering how far the sound carried. It's gas-powered, so it's got some noise to it, but I was only running it for maybe 15, 20 minutes total, just long enough to drill 3 holes, and you're done with it now. Yeah, it's sitting out on the ice. Won't need it again unless I move spots later. Kyle turned back to Patricia. So the disturbing noise has already ended. Even if there was a violation, which there wasn't, it would be resolved by now. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue more, but Kyle was already closing his notebook. I'm going to head out unless there's anything else. There's nothing else, I said. Thanks for coming out and clearing this up. No problem. Enjoy your fishing. Kyle started walking back to his truck, leaving Patricia and me standing in awkward silence. She was staring at me with barely contained fury. This isn't over, she said quietly. Patricia, there's nothing to continue. I'm on property I have rights to. I'm not breaking any laws. I'm just trying to fish. You woke up my entire neighborhood. I'm sorry about that, genuinely. But I didn't know the sound would carry that far, and more importantly, I didn't do anything wrong. If you want a completely silent Saturday morning, maybe don't buy a house next to a lake where people do lake activities. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Instead, she turned and marched back toward Meadowbrook Estates, her boots crunching on the snow-covered shore. I watched her go, then grabbed my gear and headed back out onto the ice. My tip-ups were right where I'd left them, untouched and waiting. The morning was getting on toward 8:30 now, and I'd lost almost 2 hours of fishing time to this ridiculous confrontation. I settled onto my bucket, poured some coffee from my thermos, and tried to relax. The lake was quiet again, just the way I liked it. In the distance, I could see Meadowbrook Estates, a cluster of identical houses with their neat yards and uniform fencing. Patricia was probably back there right now, stewing in her anger and plotting her next move. I didn't have to wait long to find out what that would be, around 10 a.m. Just as I was reeling in my first decent pike of the day, I saw movement on the shore again. Not just one person this time, but 3. Patricia was back, and she'd brought reinforcements. I landed the pike, a nice 22-incher, and held it up to admire it before releasing it back through the hole. By the time I looked up again, the 3 people were halfway across the ice, moving in formation like some kind of HOA assault team. As they got closer, I could make out 2 men accompanying Patricia. One was older, maybe 60, wearing an expensive-looking winter coat and walking with the self-assured stride of someone used to being in charge. The other was younger, probably mid-40s, carrying what looked like a clipboard. "Mr. Palmer," Patricia called out when they were about 30 yards away. "We need to talk." I stayed seated on my bucket. "I think we covered everything this morning. They came to a stop in front of me, close enough that I had to look up at them. Patricia gestured to the older man. "This is Richard Montgomery, the president of our HOA board. And this is Dennis Harper, our HOA attorney." An attorney. She'd brought an attorney to a frozen lake to harass someone about ice fishing. This was getting absurd. Richard extended his hand. I stood up and shook it, more out of habit than anything else. "Mr. Palmer, I understand there was an incident this morning regarding noise levels," Richard said. His voice was smooth, practiced. "Patricia briefed me on the situation, and I wanted to come out here personally to see if we could come to some kind of understanding." "There's not much to understand. I was fishing. I used an auger. It made noise. I have every right to be here." Dennis, the attorney, spoke up. "Actually, that's what we wanted to discuss. After reviewing the property records and the bylaws of both associations, we believe there may be some overlapping jurisdiction that hasn't been properly addressed." Overlapping jurisdiction. The lake borders multiple properties, including those in Meadowbrook Estates. While you may have access rights through your association, those rights don't supersede the reasonable expectation of peace and quiet for surrounding property owners. I couldn't help but laugh. "You're joking, right? You think you can tell me I can't fish on a lake I own a piece of because it might be slightly noisy?" "We're not saying you can't fish," Richard said, his tone conciliatory. "We're saying there need to be guidelines. Reasonable hours, acceptable noise levels, that sort of thing." "There are guidelines. The Serenity Lake Property Owners Association has bylaws that govern lake usage. Your HOA isn't part of that association, so your rules don't apply." Dennis flipped through papers on his clipboard. "According to Minnesota state law regarding noise pollution and disturbing the peace, any activity that creates excessive noise and disturbs the reasonable peace and quiet of residential areas can be considered a violation, regardless of property boundaries." The deputy who was here 3 hours ago already confirmed I wasn't violating any laws. "Deputy Morrison may not have been fully informed about the relevant statutes," Dennis said. "We're prepared to file a formal complaint with the county if necessary. We're also prepared to seek an injunction against early morning activities on the portion of the lake adjacent to Meadowbrook Estates." This was escalating beyond anything I'd expected. I set down my fishing rod and gave them my full attention. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You want to restrict my access to a lake I have legal rights to because your development, which was built years after people were already using this lake, doesn't like the noise. We want to establish reasonable boundaries," Richard said. "This is a residential area now. Things are different than they were 10 or 20 years ago. The lake hasn't changed. The fish haven't changed. The people who own property here haven't changed. What's changed is that you built a bunch of houses and now you think you own everything around them." Patricia jumped in. "We're trying to protect property values. Do you know what it does to home values when people are subjected to constant noise pollution?" "Constant. I was out here for 20 minutes with an auger. That's it. Not constant, not even regular, just 20 minutes on one Saturday morning." "Today it's 20 minutes, Dennis said. "Tomorrow it's an hour. Next week it's every morning. Without clear guidelines, this could become a chronic problem." "Or," I said, "it's just a guy fishing like people have been doing here for decades, and you're massively overreacting because you can't handle the fact that the world doesn't revolve around your HOA." Richard's friendly demeanor slipped a bit. "Mr. Palmer, we're trying to be reasonable here. We're trying to find a compromise that works for everyone. A compromise would be you accepting that I have a right to use this lake, and that a little noise from an auger a few times a winter is just part of living near a lake. What you're proposing isn't a compromise. It's you trying to impose your rules on property you don't own. We're proposing a joint meeting between the Meadowbrook HOA and your lake association, Dennis said. We can draft a shared usage agreement that respects everyone's rights. We don't need a shared usage agreement. We already have bylaws. If you wanted to be part of the conversation about lake usage, you should have joined the association when you built your development. But you didn't, because you wanted your own separate HOA with your own rules, and now you're mad that those rules don't extend to the entire lake. The three of them exchanged glances. I could tell they weren't used to people pushing back this hard. We'll be filing a formal complaint with Clearwater County, Dennis said finally. And we'll be pursuing legal action if necessary to protect the rights of Meadowbrook Estates residents. You do what you need to do, I said. I'll be here fishing like I have every right to be. They turned and walked back toward shore, their little delegation defeated for the moment but clearly not done with the fight. I watched them go, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. How had a simple morning of ice fishing turned into a legal battle with an HOA I wasn't even part of? I spent the rest of the day fishing, landing a few more decent pike and a couple of perch. The weather was perfect, cold but clear, and if it weren't for the ongoing HOA drama, it would have been an ideal day on the ice. As the sun started to set around 4:30, I packed up my gear and headed back to shore. My cabin was a small 2-bedroom place, nothing fancy, but it had everything I needed. My wife, Michelle, had passed away 2 years ago, and I'd bought this place as a kind of fresh start. Somewhere quiet where I could think and remember and heal. The last thing I needed was an HOA breathing down my neck. I got a fire going in the wood stove and made myself some dinner, keeping one eye on the lake through the big window that faced the water. I half expected to see Patricia or her crew out there again, but the ice remained empty as darkness fell. The next morning, Sunday, I decided to go out again. Not to make a point, but because I wanted to fish and it was my property and my right. I set my alarm for 6, got my gear together, and headed out onto the ice just as the sky was starting to lighten. I deliberately didn't use the auger. I fished the same holes from yesterday, which had skimmed over with a thin layer of ice overnight, but were easy enough to clear with my skimmer. I wanted to fish, but I also didn't want to give Patricia any more ammunition for her complaints. The morning was peaceful. I caught a few small pike and released them, enjoying the quiet and the solitude. Around 7, I saw lights come on in some of the Meadowbrook houses, but nobody came out to bother me. Maybe they'd given up. I was wrong about that. Monday morning, I got a call from my neighbor, Tom Bradley. Tom owned the cabin 2 properties down from mine and had been on the lake even longer than I had. "Stephen, you hear about this HOA thing?" he asked. "The Meadowbrook people." "Yeah, I had a run-in with them Saturday. They're trying to call a special meeting of the Lake Association. Got an email this morning. They want to propose new bylaws about noise and usage hours. They're not even members of the association." That's what I said. But apparently they got some attorney involved and he's claiming they have standing because they border the lake. It's a whole mess. I rubbed my eyes. "When's the meeting?" "Wednesday night, 7 p.m. at the Pine Ridge Community Center. You planning to go? Wouldn't miss it." Wednesday evening arrived cold and clear. I drove into Pine Ridge, a small town of about 3,000 people that served as the hub for the lake communities around it. The community center was a low brick building near the old downtown, usually used for church potlucks and local government meetings. I walked in to find the meeting room already half full. I recognized most of the faces from Lake Association gatherings over the years. Tom was there, along with Janet Simmons, Harold Price, and most of the other property owners. But there were also new faces, people I didn't recognize, all clustered together on one side of the room. The Meadowbrook contingent. Patricia spotted me immediately and whispered something to the woman next to her. I found a seat next to Tom. "This should be interesting," Tom muttered. The meeting was called to order by Frank Peterson, the current president of the Serenity Lake Property Owners Association. Frank was in his 70s, retired from teaching, and had been managing the association for the past decade. "Evening, everyone," Frank said, his voice carrying across the room. "Thanks for coming out on short notice. We've got an unusual situation tonight. We've been contacted by the Meadowbrook Estates HOA regarding lake usage and noise concerns. I've invited their representatives to present their case, and then we'll discuss as an association how we want to proceed." Richard Montgomery stood up, Dennis Harper right behind him. Patricia remained seated but looked ready to jump in at any moment. "Thank you, Frank," Richard said. "We appreciate the opportunity to address this body. As you know, Meadowbrook Estates is a residential community of 43 homes located on the southern shore of Lake Serenity. Our residents moved to this area seeking peace, quiet, and natural beauty. However, in recent months, we've experienced increasing disturbances from lake activities, particularly early morning noise from motorized equipment." "Recent months," I whispered to Tom. "I've used my auger twice this winter," Richard continued. "We're not here to restrict anyone's access to the lake. We simply want to establish reasonable guidelines that protect everyone's quality of life. We're proposing that the association adopt new bylaws limiting the use of motorized equipment to the hours between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., and requiring that all such equipment meet certain noise level standards." Dennis stood up next, holding his clipboard. "I have a draft of the proposed bylaws here if anyone would like to review them. These are standard provisions found in many lake associations throughout Minnesota. They're designed to balance recreational use with residential peace and quiet." Frank looked out at the room. "Questions or comments?" My hand shot up immediately. "I've got some thoughts." "Stephen Palmer," Frank said, nodding at me. "Go ahead." I stood up. "First off, I want to make it clear that Meadowbrook Estates is not part of this association. They don't pay dues. They don't vote on bylaws. They have no standing to come in here and demand we change our rules to suit their preferences." Several people nodded in agreement. Richard tried to interrupt, but Frank held up a hand. "Let him finish," Frank said. "Second, this lake has been used for fishing, including ice fishing, for as long as anyone can remember. Those of us who own property here bought in with the understanding that this is an active recreational lake. If Meadowbrook residents wanted a completely silent lake with no activities, they should have bought property on a private pond, not on a lake with an established property owners association." Patricia stood up. "We have just as much right to enjoy the lake as you do. You have the right to enjoy the view of the lake from your property. You don't have the right to control what happens on the lake itself. There's a big difference. The noise affects us regardless of property boundaries," Patricia shot back. "Living near a lake means there's going to be some noise. Boats in the summer, ice augers in the winter, kids swimming. That's what lakes are for. If you can't handle that, you shouldn't have bought a lake house." Frank cleared his throat. "Let's try to keep this civil." "Richard, can I ask you a question? Did your development do any environmental or community impact studies before building on the lake? Did you reach out to this association during your planning phase?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "The land was zoned residential. We met all the county requirements for the development." "That's not what I asked. Did you consult with the existing lake association?" "We weren't required to." "Right, but it might have been a good idea, don't you think?" You built 43 houses on a lake that already had an established community and set of usage patterns. Now you're upset that the lake is being used the way it's always been used. Dennis stepped in. With respect, Mr. Peterson, the law is clear that property owners have a right to peaceful enjoyment of their property. Excessive noise, regardless of the source, can constitute a nuisance. We're not trying to be unreasonable. We're simply asking for some basic guidelines. Harold Price, who owned one of the older cabins on the West Shore, stood up. I've been coming to this lake since 1982. My father brought me here as a kid in the 60s. We've been ice fishing here every winter without fail. I've never heard a single complaint about auger noise until now. You know why? Because the people who lived here before understood that this is a working lake. It's not a postcard. It's not a decorative feature for your development. It's a real lake where real people do real activities. Times change, Patricia said. Standards evolve. Standards, sure. But basic property rights don't. We own this lake collectively through this association. You don't. You can't just walk in here and demand we change our bylaws because you don't like the sound of progress. The meeting devolved into a back and forth for another 30 minutes, with members of the Lake Association pushing back against almost everything the Meadowbrook representatives proposed. Finally, Frank called for order. Here's what we're going to do, he said. The board will review the proposed bylaws and consider whether any modifications to our current rules are warranted. We'll make our decision based on what's best for the lake and for our members, not based on pressure from outside groups. We'll notify everyone of our decision within 2 weeks. That's unacceptable, Richard said. We need a resolution now. Then you're going to be disappointed, Frank replied. This is our association, our lake, and our process. If you don't like it, you're welcome to pursue whatever legal remedies you think you have. But we're not going to be bullied into changing rules that have worked fine for decades. The Meadowbrook group left shortly after that, clearly unhappy with the outcome. The rest of us stayed to discuss the situation. They're going to sue, Janet Simmons said. She ran a small accounting business in Pine Ridge and had been treasurer of the association for years. That attorney didn't come here just to make suggestions. He came here to build a case. Let them sue, Tom said. We've got property rights on our side. Lawsuits are expensive, Janet countered. Even if we win, it could cost the association thousands in legal fees. Our dues aren't set up to cover that kind of expense. Frank looked around the room. We might need to do a special assessment if it comes to that. But I'm not ready to cave to their demands just to avoid a lawsuit. We're in the right here. I raised my hand again. What if we get out in front of this? What if we file something with the county formally establishing our exclusive usage rights to the lake? Make it crystal clear that Meadowbrook has no jurisdiction. That's not a bad idea, Frank said. Janet, can you look into what that would cost and what the process would be? I'll make some calls. The meeting broke up around 9. As I was heading out to my truck, Tom caught up with me. You really kicked a hornet's nest with this one, didn't you? He said, but he was smiling. I was just trying to catch some fish. Well, now you're the face of the resistance against HOA tyranny. How does it feel? Exhausting. I drove back to the cabin. The darkness of the rural roads broken only by my headlights and the occasional farmhouse. I couldn't stop thinking about the meeting, about Patricia's insistence that they had rights to control the lake, about that attorney with his clipboard and his threats of legal action. When I got home, I poured myself a bourbon and sat by the window, looking out at the dark expanse of the frozen lake. The ice was thick enough to drive a truck on now, solid and safe. People would be out there all winter, fishing and snowmobiling and enjoying themselves. The thought of letting an HOA dictate when and how we could use our own lake was infuriating. The next morning, Thursday, I got a call from Frank. "Stephen, we've got a problem," he said. "I just got served with a temporary restraining order." "What?" Meadowbrook filed an emergency petition with the county court. They're claiming that ongoing noise pollution is causing irreparable harm to their residents' health and property values. The judge granted a temporary order restricting motorized equipment use on the lake between the hours of 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. I felt my stomach drop. They can't do that. They just did. It's temporary pending a full hearing next week, but until then we're supposed to comply. This is insane. I know. I've already called our insurance company to see if our liability policy covers legal representation. Janet's reaching out to some attorneys. But in the meantime, we need to follow the order. So they win, just like that, just temporarily. We're going to fight this, Stephen. But we have to do it the right way. I spent the rest of Thursday in a frustrated haze, alternating between anger at the situation and disbelief that it had gotten this far. An HOA I wasn't even part of had managed to restrict my use of my own property through some legal maneuvering. It felt profoundly wrong. Friday afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Palmer, this is Daniel Foster. I'm an attorney specializing in property rights and HOA law. Janet Simmons from your Lake Association reached out to me about your situation." "Oh, good. Yeah, this whole thing is a mess. I've reviewed the restraining order and the underlying complaint. I have to say, this is one of the more aggressive HOA overreaches I've seen. They're on pretty shaky legal ground. Can we get the order lifted? I think we have a good shot." The hearing is scheduled for next Wednesday. I'd like to represent the Lake Association and you specifically, since you were named in the complaint. Me specifically. You're the primary defendant. Patricia Morrison's affidavit focuses heavily on the incident from last Saturday, naming you as the source of the disturbance. Of course she did. The good news is that their case is weak. They're not members of your association. They have no ownership stake in the lake, and they're trying to restrict legal activities on private property they don't control. The bad news is that judges sometimes grant these temporary orders out of an abundance of caution, and it can take time to unwind them. So what do? We prepare for the hearing. I'll need statements from you and other Lake Association members, documentation of your ownership rights, copies of the association bylaws, historical evidence of lake usage patterns. We build a case showing that you've been using the lake legally and that Meadowbrook has no standing to restrict that use. I can do that. Good. Also, Stephen, I want to prepare you for the possibility that this gets worse before it gets better. HOAs like this one, when they get pushback, they tend to double down. They might file additional complaints, try to involve more agencies, really turn up the pressure. Let them try. I'm not backing down. That's the spirit. Just be smart about it. Don't give them any ammunition. Follow the temporary restraining order even though it's frustrating. Document everything. If they harass you, record it. If they make threats, save them. We want to show the court that they are the unreasonable ones, not you. Over the weekend, I threw myself into preparing for the hearing. I dug out every document related to my property purchase, my membership in the Lake Association, and the history of the lake itself. Tom helped me compile a list of everyone who'd been ice fishing on the lake over the past decade. Harold found some old photos from the 80s showing dozens of fishing shacks dotting the frozen surface, proof that this had always been an active fishing lake. Monday morning, I got another surprise. A news van from one of the Duluth TV stations pulled up to my cabin. A reporter, a young woman with a microphone and a cameraman in tow, knocked on my door. Mr. Palmer, I'm Sarah Chen from KDLH News. We're doing a story on the dispute between the Meadowbrook HOA and the Serenity Lake Property Owners Association. Would you be willing to talk to us? I hesitated. Daniel had said to document everything, and public opinion might actually help our case. Sure, I said. What do you want to know? The interview lasted about 15 minutes. I explained the situation as clearly as I could. I owned property on a private lake. I was engaged in legal recreational activities, and an HOA I wasn't part of was trying to restrict my rights. Sarah seemed genuinely interested, asking good questions about property ownership and the legal dispute. This is really a story about HOA overreach, isn't it? She said as we wrapped up. That's exactly what it is. I'm just a guy trying to fish on a lake I have legal rights to. They're trying to control property that isn't theirs. We're also reaching out to the Meadowbrook HOA for their side of the story. Good. I hope they go on camera. I'd love for people to hear their justification for this. The story aired that evening on the 6 o'clock news. They framed it exactly as I'd hoped, as a David versus Goliath story about individual property rights versus HOA power. They included a brief statement from Meadowbrook, with Patricia saying something about protecting residential quality of life, but the overall tone of the piece was sympathetic to my side. By Tuesday, the story had been picked up by the Minneapolis stations and the Star Tribune. My phone started ringing with calls from reporters, property rights advocacy groups, and even a couple of national news outlets. The story had apparently hit a nerve. People really didn't like HOAs, and they really didn't like the idea of one restricting lake access. Tuesday evening, I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, I heard Patricia's voice, tight with barely controlled anger. "I hope you're happy with yourself," she said. "You've turned this into a media circus." I didn't turn it into anything. A reporter showed up and asked me questions. I answered them honestly. "You made us look like villains." "Patricia, you got a restraining order against me for ice fishing. You kind of did that to yourselves. We were protecting our community. You were overstepping your authority." There's a big difference. The negative attention is affecting property values in Meadowbrook. We've had 3 prospective buyers back out of deals because they saw the news coverage and don't want to be associated with the controversy. Again, that's not my problem. Maybe if you hadn't decided to try to control a lake you don't own, none of this would have happened. This isn't over, Mr. Palmer. Not by a long shot. She hung up before I could respond. I stared at my phone, wondering what new escalation she was planning. I found out Wednesday morning, the day of the hearing. I woke up to find my truck's tires slashed, all 4 of them, and someone had spray-painted noise polluter across the driver's side door in bright red paint. I called the sheriff's department immediately. A different deputy arrived within 20 minutes, not Kyle Morrison, but an older officer named Deputy Sarah Thompson. She took photos, dusted for prints, and took my statement. "You have any idea who might have done this?" she asked. "I've got a pretty good guess. I'm in a dispute with the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. It's gotten pretty heated. The ice fishing thing, I heard about that. Yeah, the president of the HOA called me last night pretty angry about media coverage. Now this. You have any proof it was them?" "No direct proof, but the timing is pretty suspicious. I'll file a report for vandalism. If you have security cameras, that footage would be helpful." "I don't, unfortunately. It's pretty remote out here." She nodded sympathetically. "I'd recommend getting some. If this dispute is escalating, you'll want to protect yourself and document any future incidents." After she left, I called Daniel Foster and explained what happened. "This actually might help our case," he said. "It shows that they're engaging in escalating behavior, possibly illegal behavior. Bring photos to the hearing. We'll make sure the judge knows about it. The hearing's in 3 hours. I don't have a vehicle. I'll come pick you up. We need to be there anyway. The hearing was held at the Clearwater County Courthouse in Bagley, a small town about 20 miles from Pine Ridge. Daniel picked me up in his Volvo and we drove through the gray January landscape, past snow-covered fields and patches of forest. "How are you feeling?" Daniel asked. "Honestly, angry, tired, but ready to fight this." "Good. Remember in there, stay calm. Answer questions directly. Don't let them bait you into getting emotional. We want to present you as the reasonable party who's being harassed." The courtroom was smaller than I expected, more like a conference room than the grand chambers you see on TV. Judge Maria Sandoval presided, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. The Meadowbrook side had their attorney, Dennis Harper, plus Patricia and Richard. They all sat on one side of the room, looking confident. I sat with Daniel on the other side, with Frank Peterson and Janet Simmons behind us representing the Lake Association. Judge Sandoval called the hearing to order. "This is a hearing regarding the temporary restraining order issued last week in the matter of Meadowbrook Estates, HOA versus Stephen Palmer and the Serenity Lake Property Owners Association. Mr. Harper, you filed the original petition. Would you like to present your case for making the order permanent?" Dennis stood up, confident and polished. "Thank you, Your Honor." The Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, represents 43 families who purchased homes in a residential development, with the reasonable expectation of a peaceful living environment. Over the past several months, that peace has been repeatedly disturbed by excessive noise from motorized equipment operated on Lake Serenity by Mr. Palmer and potentially other members of his association. "How often has this occurred?" the judge asked. Dennis consulted his notes. "We have documented at least 7 incidents over the past 3 months. 7 incidents in 3 months. That's about twice a month." "Yes, Your Honor. And these incidents typically occur in the early morning hours when our residents are entitled to quiet enjoyment of their properties." "What constitutes early morning in your complaint?" "Generally between 6 and 8 a.m. "And what is the source of the noise?" "Primarily gas-powered ice augers used for fishing, though we've also documented boat motors and jet skis during warmer months." Judge Sandoval turned to Daniel. "Mr. Foster, your response." Daniel stood, composed and ready. "Your Honor, this case fundamentally comes down to property rights. The Meadowbrook HOA is attempting to restrict legal activities on property they don't own, don't control, and have no jurisdiction over. Lake Serenity is a private lake owned collectively by the members of the Serenity Lake Property Owners Association, of which Mr. Palmer is a member in good standing." He handed a folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "These are the association bylaws, property deeds, and historical usage documentation. They clearly establish that Mr. Palmer has legal access to the lake for recreational purposes, including fishing." "And the noise issue?" the judge asked. "Your Honor, the sounds described in the complaint, augers and boat motors, are normal lake activities. They're not excessive, they're not occurring at unreasonable hours, and they're the predictable result of living near an active recreational lake. The Meadowbrook development was built adjacent to this lake in 2021, well after the Lake Association and its usage patterns were established." Patricia leaned over and whispered something urgent to Dennis. He nodded and stood up again. "Your Honor, if I may, we also have concerns about Mr. Palmer's recent behavior. He's engaged in a media campaign to defame the Meadowbrook community, causing real economic harm to our property values." "I've done no such thing. I said before I could stop myself. The judge looked at me. Mr. Palmer, you'll have a chance to speak. Mr. Foster, address this claim. Your Honor, Mr. Palmer spoke to reporters who contacted him about a legitimate news story. He answered questions honestly about a legal dispute. That's not defamation. That's exercising his First Amendment rights. What about the vandalism, Your Honor? I said, and Daniel shot me a look but didn't stop me. This morning, someone slashed all 4 tires on my truck and spray painted it. This happened hours after Patricia Morrison called me to complain about the news coverage. Are you accusing Mrs. Morrison of vandalism? The judge asked. I'm saying the timing is suspicious. I filed a police report. I brought photos. I pulled out my phone. Dennis stood up quickly. Your Honor, this is completely unfounded. Mrs. Morrison would never engage in such behavior, and this accusation is exactly the kind of character assassination we've been dealing with. I'm not assassinating anyone's character. I'm stating facts. Someone vandalized my property, and it happened right after she threatened me. I did not threaten you, Patricia said loudly. Order, Judge Sandoval said firmly. Everyone calm down. Mr. Palmer, do you have evidence linking anyone from Meadowbrook to the vandalism? Not yet, no. But I'm asking the court to consider the pattern of escalating behavior. The judge made some notes. Let's focus on the actual issue at hand, which is the restraining order. Mr. Harper, what specific relief is your client seeking? We're asking the court to make the temporary order permanent, restricting the use of motorized equipment on Lake Serenity to the hours of 9 a.m. to 8 p.m., and requiring that all such equipment meet noise standards not exceeding 70 decibels measured from any residential property line. Mr. Foster, we're asking that the order be dissolved entirely. The Meadowbrook HOA has no standing to dictate usage of Lake Serenity. They don't own it. They're not members of the association that does own it. They simply want to control property that isn't theirs because they find normal lake activities mildly inconvenient. Judge Sandoval leaned back in her chair, thinking. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the heating system. Here's my concern, she finally said. Mr. Harper, your clients built a development next to an established recreational lake. The activities they're complaining about didn't start recently. They've been happening for decades. Your clients chose to build there, chose to buy there with full knowledge that it was an active lake. Your Honor, that doesn't negate their rights as property owners, Dennis argued. No, but it does affect their reasonable expectations. You can't move next to a lake and then demand the lake stop being a lake. She turned to Daniel. That said, Mr. Foster, there is something to be said for being a good neighbor. Is your client willing to voluntarily adjust his schedule to accommodate reasonable concerns? Mr. Palmer has been ice fishing at various times of day for years without complaint until recently. He's not opposed to being considerate, but he shouldn't be legally required to restrict his use of his own property based on demands from people who don't own that property. The judge made more notes, then looked up at both sides. I'm dissolving the temporary restraining order. The Meadowbrook HOA has not demonstrated sufficient standing or sufficient harm to justify restricting legal activities on private property they don't control. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. Dennis started to object, but the judge held up her hand. However, she continued, I'm going to strongly suggest that both parties attempt mediation. This is a neighborhood dispute that's gotten out of hand. Maybe there's a compromise that everyone can live with. The court can provide a mediator if both parties agree. We'd be willing to try mediation, Daniel said. Dennis looked at Patricia and Richard, who both shook their heads firmly. We'll have to discuss it with our board, Your Honor. You do that. In the meantime, Mr. Palmer, you're free to resume normal use of the lake. This hearing is concluded." We all stood as the judge left. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The order was lifted. I could fish again without legal repercussions. As we filed out of the courtroom, Patricia walked past me, her face red with anger. "This isn't over," she hissed. "Patricia, it really should be," I said. "Just let it go. Let people fish. Let people enjoy the lake. It's not hurting you. You don't understand what you've done to our community." "I haven't done anything to your community. I've just refused to let you control mine." Outside the courthouse, a few reporters were waiting. The story had gotten enough attention that they'd sent people to cover the hearing. I gave a brief statement, thanking the judge for recognizing property rights and expressing hope that we could all move forward peacefully. Daniel drove me back to my cabin. "That went well," he said. The judge saw right through their arguments. "You think they'll actually drop it now?" Hard to say. Some HOAs, when they lose, they accept it and move on. Others dig in deeper. Patricia Morrison strikes me as the digging in type. That's what I'm afraid of. When we got back to my place, Daniel helped me arrange for a tow truck to take my vandalized truck to a shop in Pine Ridge. Then he left, promising to send me his invoice for the hearing. Tom came by that evening with a 6-pack of beer and a bottle of bourbon. "Victory celebration," he said. "More like relief that it's over. For now." We sat by the fire, drinking and talking about the whole ridiculous situation. Tom had been following the news coverage and said the general consensus in Pine Ridge was that the Meadowbrook people were out of line. "You've become kind of a folk hero," he said, grinning. "Standing up to HOA tyranny, people love that stuff. I didn't want to be a folk hero, I just wanted to fish." "Well, now you can. Judge said so." We drank to that, watching the flames dance in the wood stove. For the first time in over a week, I felt like maybe things would actually be okay. I should have known better. Thursday morning, I woke up to pounding on my door. I rolled out of bed, threw on a robe, and opened it to find Deputy Thompson standing there again, looking serious. "Mr. Palmer, I need you to come down to the station." "What? Why?" "Patricia Morrison filed a complaint against you for harassment and threatening behavior. She says you called her and made threats last night." "That's completely false. I haven't called her. I haven't contacted her at all except for when she's shown up here or at the hearing." "You have your phone records to prove that." "Yes, of course. But this is insane. She's making stuff up." "That may be, but we need to take the complaint seriously. Can you come down and give a statement?" I threw on clothes and drove my rental car, a basic sedan I'd gotten while my truck was being repaired, to the sheriff's station. There, I met with Deputy Thompson and her supervisor, Sergeant James Holland. They took my statement, looked at my phone records, and confirmed I hadn't called Patricia. There were no outgoing calls to her number, no texts, nothing. "This is clearly a false report," I said. "She's harassing me." "It does appear that way," Sergeant Holland agreed. "We're going to talk to Mrs. Morrison about filing a false police report. That's a crime in Minnesota." "Good. Because this is getting out of control. First the restraining order, then the vandalism, now false accusations. When does it stop? Hopefully soon. We'll handle it." I left the station frustrated but somewhat reassured. At least the police could see what was happening. That afternoon, I got a call from Frank Peterson. "Stephen, we've got another problem. The Meadowbrook HOA filed a complaint with the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources." "For what?" "They're claiming that ice fishing activity on Lake Serenity is disturbing wildlife and potentially violating environmental regulations. The DNR is sending someone out to inspect the lake." "This is unbelievable. What wildlife? It's a frozen lake in January." "I know, but we have to cooperate with the inspection. They're coming tomorrow morning." Friday morning, I met the DNR officer at the boat launch. His name was Officer Mark Hensley, and he seemed skeptical about the whole thing from the start. "So, what exactly am I supposed to be looking for?" he asked, reviewing the complaint on his tablet. "Your guess is as good as mine. This is harassment by the HOA. They keep filing complaints hoping something will stick." We walked out onto the ice together. I showed him where I'd been fishing, explained my normal practices, pointed out that I always followed size limits and catch limits, that I released most of what I caught anyway. Mark took some notes, looked around at the pristine frozen landscape. "Mr. Palmer, I don't see any evidence of environmental violations here. Your fishing holes are properly spaced. You're not leaving trash or equipment behind, and frankly, ice fishing is a normal recreational activity on Minnesota lakes. I'm going to file a report saying the complaint is unfounded." "Thank you. Can you do anything about the fact that they're filing false complaints?" "That's not really my jurisdiction, but I can note in my report that this appears to be harassment rather than a legitimate environmental concern. If they keep filing frivolous complaints with the DNR, we can pursue penalties against them." "I'd appreciate that." Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated in ways I never could have imagined. The Meadowbrook HOA filed complaints with the county health department, claiming ice fishing was a potential source of water contamination. They filed complaints with the county zoning board, claiming my cabin was operating as an illegal commercial fishing operation. They even filed a complaint with the post office, claiming I was using the mail to send threatening letters. Every single complaint was investigated and dismissed. But each one required time, energy, and in some cases, money for legal representation. Daniel Foster was racking up billable hours defending me against increasingly absurd accusations. The Lake Association called an emergency meeting. Everyone was frustrated, and the legal fees were adding up. We'd already spent nearly $5,000 from the association's reserve fund. "We need to go on the offensive," Tom said at the meeting. "They're bleeding us dry with legal fees. We need to make them stop." "How do we do that?" Janet asked. Daniel, who we'd invited to the meeting, spoke up. "We could file a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment and abuse of process. They're using the legal system to harass Mr. Palmer and the association. That's actionable." "Would we win?" Frank asked. "I think we'd have a very strong case. We have documentation of multiple frivolous complaints, false police reports, and a pattern of harassment. A judge would likely see it for what it is." "But that means more legal fees," Janet pointed out. "Initially, yes. But if we win, we can recover our costs and potentially get damages. Plus, it might finally make them back off." The room was quiet for a moment, then I spoke up. "I'll fund it. This is my fight. I don't want the association to keep paying for this." "Stephen, you don't have to do that," Frank said. "Yes, I do. They're targeting me specifically. It's only fair that I cover the costs." We voted, and the decision was unanimous. We'd file a countersuit against Meadowbrook Estates HOA. The lawsuit was filed the following week. We sued for harassment, abuse of process, defamation, and infliction of emotional distress. We asked for $50,000 in damages plus legal fees. The reaction from Meadowbrook was swift and predictable. Patricia called an emergency HOA meeting and sent out a letter to all residents painting me as a vindictive neighbor trying to destroy their community. But she made a critical error. She included in her letter specific claims about me that were provably false, claiming I had a criminal record and had been arrested multiple times. I'd never been arrested. I had no criminal record. And she'd put those lies in writing and distributed them to 43 households. Daniel's eyes lit up when I showed him the letter. "This is defamation per se. She's falsely accused you of criminal activity in writing. This strengthens our case significantly. We amended our lawsuit to include the letter as evidence. By this point, the story had gained even more national attention. News outlets were running pieces about HOA overreach, property rights, and one man's fight against a bureaucratic nightmare. I did a phone interview with NPR, and the story ran on their website. The pressure was mounting on Meadowbrook. Several residents started questioning the board's decisions, according to gossip Tom heard around Pine Ridge. The legal fees from defending against our lawsuit were coming out of HOA dues, and people weren't happy about it. Then something unexpected happened. One of the Meadowbrook residents, a man named Gary Fletcher who lived on the eastern edge of the development, called me. "Mr. Palmer, you don't know me, but I want to apologize for what's been happening. I'm a member of the Meadowbrook HOA, and I had no idea things had gotten this out of hand until I saw the news coverage. I appreciate that, Mr. Fletcher. I want you to know that not everyone in Meadowbrook supports what Patricia and the board are doing. A lot of us think they've lost their minds. We like living near the lake. We don't mind the fishing boats or the ice augers. That's part of the charm. That's good to hear. I'm organizing a petition to recall the current board and replace them with people who will drop this ridiculous fight. I wanted you to know that's happening. We're hoping to have enough signatures by the end of the month to force a special election. This was the first genuinely good news I'd had in weeks." "That would be amazing, Gary. Thank you. It's the right thing to do. This whole situation is embarrassing. We're getting a reputation as the crazy HOA, and it's affecting all of us." Over the next 3 weeks, Gary's petition gained momentum. It turned out that most Meadowbrook residents were reasonable people who'd had no idea how extreme their board had become. Patricia had been making decisions without consulting the membership, spending HOA funds on legal fees without proper authorization, and generally operating like a dictator. The special election was held in mid-March. Patricia, Richard, and 2 other board members were recalled and replaced with new leadership. One of the first acts of the new board was to contact Daniel Foster and propose settling all pending litigation. We met at a mediator's office in Duluth. The new HOA president, a retired engineer named Carl Williams, seemed genuinely embarrassed by the whole situation. "Mr. Palmer, on behalf of Meadowbrook Estates, I want to apologize for everything that's happened. The previous board acted inappropriately and outside their authority. We want to make this right." "I appreciate that," I said. "We're prepared to drop all complaints against you and the Lake Association. We'll issue a formal apology, and we'll pay your legal fees plus an additional $20,000 in compensation for the harassment you've endured." Daniel and I exchanged glances. It was a good offer. "What about Patricia?" I asked. "Is she facing any consequences? The board is pursuing legal action against her personally for the defamation letter and for spending HOA funds without authorization. That's a separate matter, but we want you to know we're taking it seriously. And you'll agree not to interfere with Lake Association activities going forward." "Absolutely. We recognize that Lake Serenity is governed by its own association and that we have no jurisdiction over lake activities. We're actually exploring the possibility of joining the Lake Association as members if you'd have us." Frank, who'd come to the mediation, nodded. "We'd welcome that. The more stakeholders we have working together, the better." We finalized the settlement that day. The lawsuit was dropped, checks were issued, and formal apologies were signed. After 2 months of hell, it was finally over. A week later, I was back on the ice, auger in hand, drilling holes in the early morning light. The lake was quiet except for the sound of the motor and the crunch of steel cutting through ice. It was peaceful. It was perfect. Tom came out to join me around 7, bringing coffee and stories about the latest gossip from Pine Ridge. "Did you hear Patricia moved?" he said. "Put her house on the market and moved to Fargo. Apparently couldn't handle living in Meadowbrook anymore after the recall. I can't say I'm surprised. Gary Fletcher stopped by my place yesterday. Said the new board is working on rewriting the HOA bylaws to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. They're making it harder for any one person to have too much power." Good. That's how it should be. We fished in comfortable silence for a while, our tip-ups arranged in a circle around us. The sun rose higher, painting the snow-covered shores in shades of gold and pink. A few other fishermen had ventured out onto the lake, their voices carrying faintly across the ice. "You know what the craziest part of all this was," I said eventually. "All she had to do was nothing. Just ignore the sound of an auger for 20 minutes a few times a winter. That's it. But she couldn't do it. She had to try to control everything." "Some people are like that," Tom said. "They need to be in charge, need everything to go exactly their way, and they can't handle it when reality doesn't cooperate." Well, reality definitely didn't cooperate. No, it did not. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a message from Daniel Foster. It was a news link. I clicked on it and read the headline: "Former HOA president arrested for filing false police reports and criminal harassment." I read the article. Apparently, the sheriff's department had continued investigating the vandalism to my truck and had found evidence linking Patricia to it. Security footage from a neighbor's camera had captured her car driving past my cabin around the time of the vandalism. When confronted, she'd apparently confessed not only to the vandalism, but also to filing the false police report. She was being charged with multiple misdemeanors and possibly a felony. "Tom, look at this." He read the article, his eyebrows rising. "Wow, she really went all in on this, didn't she?" "Apparently so." "Think she'll do any jail time?" Daniel said false police reports and vandalism are serious. "She might." We went back to fishing. Around noon, I landed a beautiful northern pike, maybe 25 inches, fat and healthy. I held it up, admiring the way the sunlight caught its scales, then gently released it back through the hole. It darted away into the dark water below the ice, free and wild. That's how I felt too, free. The battle was over. The lake was mine again, ours, the collective property of people who respected it and each other. The HOA that had tried to control what it had no right to control was gone, replaced by reasonable people who understood boundaries and community. I stayed on the ice until sunset, longer than I usually did, just because I could. The temperature dropped as the sun disappeared, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. My breath plumed in the cold air, and my hands were stiff even in thick gloves, but I didn't care. I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I wanted to do, on property I had every right to be on. The legal resolution came through in April. Patricia pleaded guilty to filing a false police report and criminal mischief, the charge related to the vandalism. She was sentenced to 6 months in county jail, though she'd likely serve less than that with good behavior, plus probation and community service. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my truck and a fine to the county. The civil settlement with Meadowbrook was finalized. The $20,000 covered my legal fees, and then some. I donated the extra to the Lake Association's reserve fund, which seemed appropriate given how much the association had supported me through the whole ordeal. True to their word, the new Meadowbrook board applied to join the Serenity Lake Property Owners Association. They were accepted unanimously at our spring meeting. Carl Williams was even elected to the Lake Association board, bringing what Frank called a valuable perspective from the residential development side. The first joint meeting between the new Meadowbrook leadership and the Lake Association was civil and productive. We discussed lake maintenance, zebra mussel prevention, and coordinating events like the annual fishing tournament and 4th of July boat parade. It was everything the relationship should have been from the beginning, if only Patricia had been willing to work together instead of trying to dominate. By summer, the entire incident had faded into local legend, one of those stories people told about crazy HOAs and property disputes. I became the guy who'd stood up to the Meadowbrook HOA and won, which was fine, though I preferred to just be the guy who fished a lot. I spent that summer on the water almost every evening, taking my boat out at sunset and casting for bass along the weed lines. Sometimes Gary Fletcher or other Meadowbrook residents would wave from their docks, friendly and respectful. The sound of my boat motor didn't seem to bother anyone anymore. In late August, the Lake Association held its annual meeting and picnic. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, sunny and warm, with the lake sparkling blue under a cloudless sky. Everyone brought food, and we set up tables near the boat launch for the potluck. Tom was there with his family. Frank and Janet came with their spouses. Harold brought his famous smoked fish. And to my surprise, Carl Williams showed up with a delegation from Meadowbrook, carrying trays of food and cases of beer. We figured it was time to officially become part of the community, Carl said, shaking my hand. Thanks for giving us a second chance. Thanks for being reasonable, I replied. That's all anyone wanted. We ate and talked and laughed, watching kids swim off the dock and jump from the diving platform. Boats cruised past, their passengers waving. Someone set up a volleyball net, and an impromptu tournament started. As the sun began to set, painting the lake in shades of gold, Frank called everyone together for the official association business. We reviewed the financials, which were healthier now thanks to the settlement and the addition of Meadowbrook's dues-paying members. We discussed maintenance projects and rules updates. Then Frank said something I wasn't expecting. I want to recognize Stephen Palmer for his courage in standing up for all our rights this past winter. A lot of people would have just given up or given in to avoid the hassle. Stephen didn't. He fought for what was right, and because of that, we're all better off. Stephen, we want to present you with this. He handed me a plaque. It read, "To Stephen Palmer in recognition of his defense of property rights and community values. Serenity Lake Property Owners Association, 2025. I felt my throat tighten. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Tom called out. Just keep fishing and being stubborn. Everyone laughed and we moved on to the rest of the meeting, but I held that plaque carefully, thinking about everything that had happened. The confrontations on the ice, the legal battles, the stress and frustration and anger. And then the resolution, the apologies, the new relationships formed. It had all started because I wanted to drill some holes in the ice and catch some fish. Such a simple thing. But it had become about something bigger. The right to use your own property, the limits of HOA power, and the importance of standing up for yourself when authorities without actual authority try to push you around. As the picnic wound down and people started packing up to head home, I walked down to the shore and looked out at the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the darkening sky. I could see my cabin in the distance, a small structure but mine, my refuge and my home. Next winter, I'd be back on the ice with my auger, drilling holes and fishing for pike. The sound would carry across the frozen surface, probably loud enough to be heard from Meadowbrook. But this time, nobody would complain. This time, everyone would understand that it was just the sound of the lake being used the way it was meant to be used, I smiled, feeling the weight of the plaque in my hands and the weight of the past months lifting from my shoulders. It was over, really over. And everything had turned out exactly as it should. The lake was still mine, still ours, and that was all that mattered.